The marble floors of the Riverside Country Club gleamed under crystal chandeliers as Chicago's elite mingled with champagne flutes and practiced smiles. Jeff Martinez stood near the service entrance, adjusting his black catering vest one final time before stepping into the glittering world where he didn't belong. The annual Children's Hospital fundraiser drew the city's wealthiest families, and tonight he was just another invisible face serving their gourmet appetizers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He balanced a silver tray of shrimp cocktail and moved through the crowd with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate spaces where his presence was barely tolerated. The conversations around him buzzed with talk of summer homes in the Hamptons, private school admissions, and stock portfolios that could fund small countries. Jeff kept his eyes down, focusing on his task, trying not to think about how different his life had been just 5 years ago. That's when he heard the reporter's voice, cutting through the ambient chatter like a knife through silk. "Miss Victoria, there are rumors about your dating life. Is it true you've been seen with someone outside your usual social circle?" The question hung in the air with the weight of loaded dice, and Jeff instinctively looked up from his tray. Victoria Ashford stood frozen at the center of a media scrum, her emerald dress catching the light like captured starfire. She was the daughter of Richard Ashford, the real estate mogul whose empire stretched across 3 states, and at 28 she commanded attention wherever she went. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her blue eyes held the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about rent or grocery bills. The reporter pressed harder, sensing blood in the water. "There are photos of you at Millennium Park last weekend with a man who appeared to be working class. Care to comment?" Jeff felt his stomach drop as recognition dawned. He had been at the park with his 6-year-old daughter Sophia, and Victoria had been there too, though he hadn't realized she'd noticed him. Victoria's cheeks flushed pink, and without thinking, her gaze swept across the room until it landed directly on Jeff. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. He saw something flicker in her expression, embarrassment mixed with panic, and then she spoke words that would echo in his mind for weeks to come. "I would never date someone like that," Victoria declared, her voice carrying further than intended. "Someone who serves food for a living." The words hit Jeff like a physical blow, and he watched as she immediately seemed to regret them, her hand flying to her mouth as if she could take them back. The silence that followed was deafening. Jeff felt every eye in the room turn toward him, and he became acutely aware of his uniform, his calloused hands, his presence, in a world where he was meant to be invisible. The tray in his hands trembled slightly, and he set it down on the nearest table before the shrimp could scatter across the polished floor. Victoria's eyes were wide, with what looked like horror at her own words, but the damage was done. The reporter scribbled notes furiously while cameras flashed, capturing the moment for tomorrow's society pages. Jeff straightened his shoulders, summoned what remained of his dignity, and walked toward the service exit with measured steps that betrayed none of the humiliation burning in his chest. As Jeff pushed through the swing doors into the service corridor, he leaned against the cool wall and closed his eyes, trying to push down the familiar ache of being dismissed and diminished. This wasn't the first time his current circumstances had made him feel less than human, but somehow, Victoria's public rejection stung more than the others. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Maybe it was because for just a moment at the park last weekend, when she'd smiled at Sophia's laughter on the swings, he'd thought he'd seen something different in her eyes. Something that suggested she might see beyond the uniform to the man underneath. Jeff had been catering these high society events for 3 years now, ever since his architecture firm had collapsed in spectacular fashion. He'd once designed buildings that graced magazine covers, had employed 15 people, and owned a loft in River North that overlooked the Chicago River. But that was before the economic downturn, before his business partner's embezzlement, before the lawsuits that had stripped him of everything except his responsibility to his daughter. Now he lived in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, working 3 jobs to make ends meet. Catering on weekends, construction during the week, and freelance drafting at night after Sophia went to sleep. Every dollar was accounted for, every expense carefully calculated. His daughter's needs came first, always, which meant his own pride had become a luxury he couldn't afford. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was serving appetizers in a ballroom he might have designed in his previous life. The architectural details caught his trained eye, the way the lighting created perfect ambiance, the flow of the space that encouraged natural mingling, the acoustic design that allowed conversation without echo. He recognized good work when he saw it, even when he was no longer the one creating it. Sophia didn't know about his former success. To her, Daddy had always worked with his hands, had always come home tired and dusty, had always checked the bank account twice before agreeing to small treats like ice cream or a new book. She was 6 years old and thought their life was perfectly normal, which was exactly how Jeff wanted it. She didn't need to carry the weight of their circumstances, or understand why other children had bigger bedrooms and more toys. What she did know was that Daddy loved her more than anything in the world, that he never missed a school play or parent-teacher conference, that he made the best pancakes on Sunday mornings, and that when she had nightmares, he would sit by her bed and tell her stories about brave princesses who saved kingdoms with their kindness. Those were the moments that made everything else bearable. Tonight, as Jeff finished his shift and collected his payment from the catering manager, he tried to push Victoria Ashford's words out of his mind. He had learned long ago that the opinions of wealthy strangers shouldn't matter to him, but as he walked to his old Honda Civic in the employee parking area, he couldn't shake the image of her face when she'd spoken those dismissive words, or the way she'd looked immediately afterward, as if she'd surprised herself with her own cruelty. Tomorrow he would pick up Sophia from his neighbor Mrs. Chen, who watched her during his evening jobs. They would have their Sunday tradition of pancakes and cartoons, and he would focus on what truly mattered. The rest of the world, with its judgments and hierarchies, could keep spinning without him. He had everything he needed in a 6-year-old girl who thought her daddy was the strongest, smartest, most wonderful man in the world, and that was worth more than all the approval of Chicago's elite combined. Victoria Ashford had built her reputation on control. At 28, she managed 3 divisions of Ashford Properties, oversaw charitable foundations worth millions, and maintained a social calendar that would exhaust most people half her age. She had graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, spoke 4 languages fluently, and could negotiate real estate deals that made seasoned executives nervous. But standing in her penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan at 2 in the morning, she felt like a complete failure. The words she had spoken at the fundraiser played on repeat in her mind like a broken record. I would never date someone like that. Someone who serves food for a living. The memory made her physically ill. She had seen the shock in the man's eyes, the way his shoulders had straightened as if bracing for impact, the careful dignity with which he had walked away. She didn't even know his name, but she had managed to humiliate him in front of Chicago's most influential people and a reporter who would undoubtedly print every cruel word. Victoria poured herself a glass of wine she wouldn't finish and stared out at the city lights reflecting on the dark water. Her penthouse was a monument to success and solitude, filled with museum-quality art, designer furniture, and the kind of silence that money could buy. She had everything she had ever thought she wanted, yet she couldn't remember the last time she had felt genuinely happy. The pressure had started early. Richard Ashford expected perfection from his only child, and Victoria had delivered it consistently for as long as she could remember. Straight A's in school, acceptance to the right university, internships at prestigious firms, and a seamless transition into the family business. She had been groomed since childhood to take over the empire her grandfather had built from nothing, and she had never questioned whether it was what she actually wanted. Her mother, Catherine, had died when Victoria was 15, leaving behind a daughter who was already learning to suppress her emotions in favor of strategic thinking. The grief had been overwhelming, but her father had made it clear that weakness was not an option. Ashfords don't fall apart, he had told her at the funeral. We honor the dead by becoming stronger. So Victoria had buried her sorrow along with her mother and focused on becoming the heir her father needed. Dating had always been complicated by her last name and her bank account. Men either wanted her money or were intimidated by it. She had endured countless dinner dates with hedge fund managers who talked about their portfolios while barely acknowledging her intelligence, politicians who saw her as a useful connection, and trust fund babies who assumed she would be impressed by their inherited wealth. None of them had ever looked at her like she was anything more than a chess piece in their own games of advancement. The few genuine relationships she had attempted had crumbled under the weight of her father's expectations and her own inability to trust anyone's motives. When she was 24, she had fallen in love with David Chen, a public school teacher who made her laugh and challenged her assumptions about the world. For 6 months, she had been happier than she had ever imagined possible. But when her father discovered the relationship, he had made his disapproval devastatingly clear. "You can play at being normal," Richard had told her over dinner at their private club, "but you have responsibilities that come with your position. You will marry someone who strengthens our family's influence, not someone who diminishes it." The conversation had been delivered with the same tone he used to discuss quarterly earnings, cold and factual and final. Victoria had tried to resist, but her father had resources she couldn't match. David's school suddenly faced budget cuts that would eliminate his position. The grant funding for his after-school program mysteriously dried up. When David had been offered a lucrative teaching position in Seattle, far from Chicago and far from Victoria, she had known exactly who was behind it. Rather than trap him in her father's web of manipulation, she had ended the relationship with surgical precision, telling David she had realized they were incompatible after all. The lie had poisoned something essential inside her, and she had never attempted another serious relationship. Instead, she dated men her father approved of, turning romance into another business obligation to be managed and optimized. She attended charity galas and gallery openings with suitable escorts, who looked perfect in photographs and felt nothing like home. That was her life when she met Jeff Martinez at Millennium Park the previous weekend. She had been there for a business lunch at the nearby restaurant when she had noticed a man pushing his daughter on the swings with the kind of focused attention that seemed rare in her world. The little girl had been giggling with pure joy, and the man had been smiling with such genuine affection that Victoria found herself pausing to watch. When the girl had fallen and scraped her knee, Victoria had witnessed something that touched her deeply. The man had dropped to his knees immediately, gathering his daughter in his arms with infinite gentleness. He had cleaned the scrape with a wet wipe from his pocket, kissed it better, and distracted her from the pain with a silly story about brave bandages that fought off infection monsters. Within minutes, the little girl was laughing again, the incident forgotten. Victoria had approached them impulsively, something she rarely did. "Is everything okay?" she had asked, crouching down to the little girl's level. "That's a very impressive bandage. I bet it's the strongest one in the whole park." The little girl had beamed at her with gap-toothed pride. "My daddy always has the best bandages. He's the best daddy in the whole world." The man had looked up at Victoria with eyes the color of dark coffee, and she had felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A flutter of genuine attraction untainted by calculation or agenda. "I'm Jeff," he had said simply, extending a hand that was calloused from work but gentle in its grip. "And this is Sophia, who is indeed the bravest patient I've ever treated." They had talked for 20 minutes while Sophia played on the monkey bars, covering safe topics like the weather and the beauty of the park. Victoria had found herself relaxing in a way that felt foreign, but wonderful. Jeff hadn't seemed to recognize her or care about her designer clothes. He had treated her like a normal person having a normal conversation on a normal Sunday afternoon. When Sophia had announced she was hungry, Jeff had apologized for cutting their conversation short. "We have a very important hot dog date," he had explained with mock seriousness. "I can't keep a lady waiting." Victoria had watched them walk toward the food vendors, Jeff's hand securely holding his daughter's, and she had felt an inexplicable longing for their easy intimacy. Now, standing in her expensive solitude, Victoria realized that 20 minutes with a stranger and his daughter had been the most genuine human connection she had experienced in months. And she had repaid Jeff's kindness by publicly humiliating him in front of hundreds of people. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter. He was a stranger who would forget about her cruelty and move on with his life. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. The look in his eyes when she had spoken those awful words would haunt her for a long time to come. Victoria walked to her home office and opened her laptop, typing Jeff Martinez Chicago into the search engine without really knowing what she hoped to find. The results were sparse and mostly unrelated, but one link caught her attention. An article from 5 years ago in the Chicago Tribune's business section with the headline, "Rising Star Architects Firm Declares Bankruptcy Amid Partner Fraud Scandal." The accompanying photo showed a younger Jeff in a suit, standing in front of architectural plans for a downtown development project. The article detailed how Martinez and Associates had been one of Chicago's most promising young firms until Jeff's business partner had embezzled nearly $2 million in client funds. The firm had collapsed overnight, leaving Jeff personally liable for debts that exceeded his assets. Victoria read the article twice, her heart sinking with each paragraph. Jeff hadn't always been a caterer struggling to make ends meet. He had been an architect, a creative professional with his own company and a bright future. The betrayal by his partner had destroyed everything he had built, and apparently he had been working service jobs ever since. She closed the laptop and walked back to the window, seeing the city skyline with new eyes. Somewhere out there, Jeff was probably getting ready for another day of whatever jobs he was working. To support his daughter, he was living with the consequences of someone else's crimes while she lived in luxury she had never earned through anything more challenging than being born to the right family. For the first time in years, Victoria felt genuinely ashamed of herself. Not just for her words at the fundraiser, but for the entire privileged bubble she inhabited. She had spent her entire adult life convinced that her problems were real and significant, but compared to rebuilding a life from nothing while raising a child alone, her concerns seemed pathetically shallow. She made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Tomorrow she would find a way to make amends for her public cruelty. She owed Jeff that much, even if he never forgave her for it. Jeff discovered the envelope on Tuesday morning, slipped under his apartment door sometime during the night. His name was written across the front in elegant handwriting, and inside he found something that made him question whether he was still dreaming. Architectural plans for a community center renovation project, detailed and professional, along with a note that simply read, "I know who you really are. Would you be willing to consult on this project? VA." He spread the blueprints across his small kitchen table, pushing aside Sophia's breakfast dishes and homework folders. The plans were for the Garfield Community Center in his own neighborhood, a building he passed every day on his way to various job sites. The current structure was aging and cramped, serving hundreds of local families who needed affordable programming for their children. According to the plans, someone was proposing a complete renovation that would triple the space while preserving the building's historic character. Jeff studied the drawings with the trained eye of someone who had once lived and breathed architecture. The design was ambitious but flawed. Whoever had drawn these plans understood the basics, but had missed crucial structural considerations. The load-bearing walls were incorrectly identified, the foundation modifications wouldn't support the proposed second-story addition, and the mechanical systems were routed in ways that would create expensive problems down the line. Despite himself, Jeff found his mind racing with solutions. He pulled out a pencil and began sketching modifications in the margins, his architect's instincts overriding 5 years of forced dormancy. Within an hour, he had identified 12 major issues and developed preliminary fixes for each one. It felt like flexing muscles he had forgotten he possessed. The return address on the envelope led him to Ashford Properties' downtown offices, a gleaming tower that pierced the Chicago skyline like a glass and steel needle. Jeff had actually admired the building from an architectural perspective, though he had never imagined he would have reason to enter it. The lobby was a study in modern minimalism, all clean lines and expensive materials that whispered rather than shouted their cost. Victoria's assistant, a polished woman in her 30s, seemed surprised when Jeff gave his name at the reception desk. "Miss Ashford is expecting you," she said, though her tone suggested she couldn't quite understand why. The elevator ride to the 40th floor gave Jeff time to second-guess his decision to come here, but curiosity had always been his weakness when it came to interesting architectural challenges. Victoria's office was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city and the lake beyond. She stood with her back to the door when he entered, studying the skyline as if looking for answers in the urban landscape. When she turned, Jeff was struck again by how different she looked from the confident society figure he had seen at the fundraiser. Here, in her professional environment, she seemed younger and somehow more vulnerable. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing toward a seating area that was more comfortable than many people's living rooms. "I wasn't sure you would." Jeff set the rolled plans on the coffee table between them. "I have to admit, I'm curious. How did you get my address? And how did you know about my background?" Victoria's cheeks colored slightly. "I did some research after Saturday night. I wanted to understand who I had." She paused, searching for the right words. "Who I had been so unnecessarily cruel to. I found the article about your firm. So you know about the bankruptcy." Jeff's voice was neutral, but Victoria caught the defensive edge underneath. "I know that your business partner embezzled money and destroyed your company through no fault of your own. I know that you lost everything because someone you trusted betrayed that trust. Victoria leaned forward, her blue eyes intense. What I don't understand is why someone with your talent and training is working catering jobs instead of practicing architecture. Jeff laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think it's that simple? You think I can just dust off my drafting tools and pretend the last 5 years never happened? I have a 6-year-old daughter to support. I need steady income, not the feast or famine uncertainty of architectural work. And even if I wanted to start over, who's going to hire an architect whose last firm collapsed in scandal? What if they didn't have to? Victoria reached for a folder on her desk and handed it to him. What if there was a way to rebuild your reputation while doing work that actually mattered? The folder contained information about the Ashford Foundation's community development initiatives. Victoria's Family Foundation funded dozens of projects across the Chicago area, focusing on education, healthcare, and community services. The Garfield Community Center renovation was just one of 15 similar projects planned for the next 2 years. I need someone to oversee the architectural aspects of these projects, Victoria explained. Someone who understands both good design and budget constraints. Someone who cares more about creating spaces that serve real people than impressing other architects with flashy concepts. Jeff flipped through the project descriptions, his mind automatically cataloging the challenges and possibilities each one presented. A new library branch in Pilsen. Affordable housing units designed for families transitioning out of homelessness. A health clinic expansion in an underserved neighborhood. These were the kinds of projects he had dreamed about when he first became an architect, before the pressure of running a business had forced him to chase more lucrative commercial developments. Why me? He asked finally. You have access to every established firm in the city. Why would you want to work with someone whose career crashed and burned? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Because I think you understand what it means to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. These communities we're trying to serve, they know that feeling too. I think you would design spaces for them the way you would want someone to design for your own daughter. The mention of Sophia hit Jeff exactly as Victoria had intended. He thought about the community center where he sometimes took her for after-school programs, with its cramped classrooms and outdated playground equipment. He thought about all the families in their neighborhood who made do with spaces that were functional but not inspiring, necessary but not beautiful. The plans you sent me have serious structural problems, Jeff said, opening the blueprints on Victoria's conference table. Whoever drew these up doesn't understand load distribution or foundation requirements. If you built this as designed, you'd have major issues within 5 years. Victoria joined him at the table, standing close enough that he caught a hint of her perfume, something subtle and expensive. Show me, she said simply. For the next hour, Jeff walked her through each flaw in the design, sketching corrections and explaining the engineering principles behind his modifications. Victoria asked intelligent questions and took careful notes, and Jeff found himself falling into the familiar rhythm of collaborative problem-solving that he had missed more than he realized. You see this section here? Jeff pointed to a proposed children's activity room. The original design treats it like dead space, just somewhere to contain kids while their parents use other parts of the building. But if you adjust the sightlines and create flexible spaces that can adapt to different activities, you turn it into the heart of the entire center. Victoria studied his revised sketch, noting how he had positioned the children's area to be visible from the main lobby and adjacent meeting rooms. So parents can participate in programs while keeping an eye on their kids, she realized. Exactly. And if you add movable partitions here and here, the space can accommodate everything from birthday parties to teen job training sessions. Good community architecture isn't just about the building, it's about understanding how people actually live and work and play together. As Jeff spoke, Victoria watched his entire demeanor transform. Gone was the guarded man who had entered her office, replaced by someone passionate and engaged and obviously brilliant at what he did. She began to understand what her research had only hinted at. Jeff Martinez hadn't just been an architect before his firm collapsed. He had been a gifted architect with a vision for how design could improve people's lives. There's something else you should know, Victoria said when they finished reviewing the plans. I'm not offering you a consulting contract. I'm offering you a permanent position as Director of Community Architecture for the Ashford Foundation. Full salary, benefits, and complete creative control over how these projects develop. Jeff stared at her, certain he had misheard. You're offering me a job? After what happened Saturday night. I'm offering you a job because of what happened Saturday night, Victoria corrected. Because it made me realize how little I actually know about the people whose lives my family's money is supposed to improve. And because you have exactly the kind of experience and perspective these projects need. Jeff sank into one of the conference room chairs, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Victoria was suggesting. A steady salary that would allow him to provide security for Sophia, work that would use his training and talents in ways that mattered. The chance to build something meaningful again instead of just surviving from paycheck to paycheck. I need time to think about this, he said finally. Of course. Take as long as you need. Victoria handed him her business card. My direct line is on there. Call me when you've decided. As Jeff gathered up the plans and headed toward the elevator, Victoria called after him. Jeff? For what it's worth, I'm sorry about Saturday night. You didn't deserve that, and I had no right to judge you based on assumptions. Jeff paused at the elevator doors, considering her words. We all make mistakes, he said quietly. The question is what we do afterward to make them right. The elevator doors closed between them, leaving Victoria alone with the uncomfortable realization that Jeff's quiet dignity made her feel smaller than any rebuke could have. She had expected anger or demands for explanation, but instead he had offered her something much more valuable, the possibility of redemption through action rather than words. Jeff spent 3 sleepless nights weighing Victoria's offer before he finally called her back. The conversation was brief and professional, but when he accepted the position, he heard something in her voice that sounded like relief. They agreed to start with a trial period on the Garfield Community Center project, giving both of them time to determine if their working relationship could overcome the awkwardness of their first encounter. The first month was a delicate dance of professional courtesy and careful boundaries. Victoria proved to be a surprisingly engaged collaborator, asking thoughtful questions about design choices and listening intently when Jeff explained the reasoning behind his modifications. She attended every planning meeting and site visit, often arriving in designer heels that were completely impractical for construction zones but never complaining about the inconvenience. Jeff watched her interact with community leaders and local residents with growing respect. Victoria didn't talk down to people or make assumptions about what they needed. Instead, she asked questions and took notes, treating every suggestion as potentially valuable. When Mrs. Rodriguez from the Neighborhood Association expressed concerns about safety in the planned teen area, Victoria immediately asked Jeff to incorporate additional lighting and sightlines into the design. I want the parents to feel confident about bringing their kids here, Victoria told him as they reviewed the latest revisions. If they don't trust the space, it doesn't matter how beautiful we make it. What surprised Jeff most was Victoria's willingness to get her hands dirty. She showed up to volunteer work days wearing jeans and old sneakers, painting walls and moving furniture alongside community volunteers. She learned the names of the construction crew and remembered details about their families. When one of the workers mentioned his daughter's quinceañera, Victoria arranged for the community center's newly renovated hall to be available for the celebration at no charge. Jeff found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about Victoria Ashford. The privileged socialite who had dismissed him so cruelly seemed to exist only in public settings. The real Victoria was curious, hard-working, and surprisingly humble about her own limitations. She deferred to his expertise on architectural matters, while contributing insights about project management and community relations that were invaluable. Their working relationship gradually evolved into something that felt almost like friendship. Victoria started bringing coffee for the entire team during their morning site meetings, and Jeff began explaining architectural concepts with the same patience he used when helping Sophia with her homework. They developed an easy rhythm of collaboration that made even complex problems feel manageable. It was during one of these collaborative sessions that Victoria learned about Sophia. Jeff had been reluctant to mention his daughter, unsure how Victoria would react to the complications of his single-parent status. But when a school holiday forced him to bring Sophia to a site visit, he had no choice but to make introductions. Sophia was everything Jeff had described and more. At 6 years old, she possessed an infectious curiosity about the world and an ability to make instant friends with anyone she met. She asked Victoria why she wore such fancy shoes to look at buildings, and whether being rich meant you never had to eat vegetables. Victoria found herself charmed by the child's directness and impressed by her obvious intelligence. "Daddy's building a new place for kids to play," Sophia explained to Victoria with serious importance. "He draws pictures of rooms and then they become real. It's like magic, but with math." Victoria watched Jeff with his daughter throughout that visit, noting the patient way he answered her endless questions and the protective instinct that kept him always within arm's reach. She saw how he included Sophia in conversations without talking down to her, treating her opinions with the same respect he showed adults. When Sophia got tired and cranky from the long day, Jeff scooped her up without hesitation, letting her rest her head on his shoulder while he continued discussing budget concerns with the contractors. That evening, Victoria found herself thinking about the easy intimacy between father and daughter. Jeff's entire world clearly revolved around Sophia's well-being, and the love between them was so natural and unforced that it made Victoria ache with something she couldn't quite name. She had grown up with nannies and boarding schools, with scheduled quality time and formal family dinners. Watching Jeff and Sophia together, she realized she had never experienced the kind of unconditional love they shared so effortlessly. The Garfield Community Center project was completed 2 months ahead of schedule and significantly under budget. The opening celebration drew hundreds of neighbors, and Victoria stood in the renovated main hall watching children play in spaces that Jeff had designed specifically for their needs. Parents gathered in conversation areas that encouraged community building while maintaining sightlines to their kids. Teenagers claimed the dedicated study spaces with obvious pride, and seniors found comfortable spots to read newspapers and play chess. "You did something amazing here," Victoria told Jeff as they watched the celebration unfold around them. "This isn't just a building renovation. You've created a space that will strengthen this entire community." Jeff smiled, but Victoria noticed his attention was focused on Sophia, who was leading a group of children in an elaborate game that seemed to involve dramatic reenactments of various fairy tales. "Architecture is just problem-solving," he said. "The real magic happens when people make a space their own." The success of the Garfield project led to additional opportunities. Victoria secured funding for 4 more community development projects, and Jeff's role with the Ashford Foundation expanded accordingly. He hired 2 junior architects and a project manager, slowly rebuilding the professional life that had been destroyed 5 years earlier. For the first time since his firm's collapse, Jeff felt like he was moving forward instead of just surviving. But it was the gradual shift in his relationship with Victoria that caught him most off guard. Their professional collaboration had evolved into something deeper and more personal, though neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge it directly. They began having dinner meetings that stretched long past any reasonable discussion of architectural plans. Victoria started asking about Sophia's school activities and remembering details about Jeff's life outside of work. When Sophia came down with the flu and Jeff had to miss several days of work to care for her, Victoria showed up at his apartment with homemade soup and a stack of children's books. She sat on the floor of their small living room reading stories to Sophia while Jeff caught up on sleep, and she seemed genuinely disappointed when the little girl recovered enough to return to school. "I never really spent time around kids before," Victoria admitted as they walked back to her car. "Sophia's extraordinary. You're raising an amazing daughter, Jeff." Jeff felt something shift in his chest at the sincere admiration in Victoria's voice. For months, he had been trying to maintain professional boundaries and ignore the growing attraction he felt toward her. But watching her interact with Sophia, seeing the genuine care and affection she showed his daughter, made it impossible to pretend his feelings were purely professional. That night, after Sophia was asleep, Jeff sat in his kitchen nursing a cup of coffee and trying to make sense of what was happening. Victoria Ashford was everything he had never thought he wanted. She was wealthy beyond his comprehension, moved in social circles he couldn't access, and carried the expectations of a family empire on her shoulders. But she was also intelligent, compassionate, and surprisingly down-to-earth when removed from her rarefied social environment. More importantly, she treated Sophia not as an inconvenience or complication, but as an integral part of Jeff's life worthy of respect and attention. She had never once suggested that his parenting responsibilities interfered with his work or hinted that he should prioritize his career over his daughter's needs. Instead, she had gone out of her way to accommodate the realities of single parenthood, offering flexible scheduling and understanding when family obligations arose. Jeff found himself imagining a future that included Victoria in more than a professional capacity, but he couldn't shake the memory of her words from that first night. "I would never date someone like that." Even though she had apologized and proven through her actions that she regretted the sentiment, he couldn't entirely forget the casual cruelty with which she had dismissed him. Moreover, the practical obstacles remained formidable. Victoria lived in a world of charity galas and society pages, private jets and exclusive resorts. Jeff's idea of a luxury vacation was taking Sophia to Great America for the day. He shopped at Target, while Victoria probably had never set foot in a store that didn't require an appointment. The gap between their lifestyles felt insurmountable, regardless of whatever personal connection was developing between them. But as Jeff finished his coffee and prepared for bed, he couldn't deny that Victoria had become an integral part of his daily thoughts. He looked forward to their meetings with an anticipation that went beyond professional interest. He found himself wondering what she would think about design decisions and community feedback. When something funny happened at a construction site, she was the first person he wanted to tell about it. Whether he was ready to admit it or not, Jeff was falling in love with Victoria Ashford. And that realization terrified him more than losing his business ever had, because this time he had Sophia's heart to protect as well as his own. 6 months after the Garfield Community Center opened, Victoria found herself standing in her father's study at 2 in the morning, holding a document that would change everything. Richard Ashford was in Switzerland on business, and Victoria had been searching for insurance papers related to one of their foundation projects when she discovered the folder hidden behind his personal files. The label read Martinez Investigation Confidential in her father's handwriting. Inside were private investigator reports, financial records, and correspondence that painted a devastating picture of deliberate sabotage. Her father hadn't just known about the embezzlement that destroyed Jeff's firm, he had orchestrated it. The reports detailed how Richard had hired Jeff's business partner, Michael Torres, to spy on Martinez and associates and steal client information. When Jeff's innovative designs began attracting attention from developers that Ashford Properties considered their exclusive territory, Richard had decided to eliminate the competition. The embezzlement was meant to be discovered gradually, giving Richard time to acquire Jeff's clients while his reputation slowly crumbled. But Michael Torres had gotten greedy, stealing more money faster than planned. When Jeff discovered the theft and threatened to prosecute, Torres had panicked and confessed everything to Richard. Rather than face exposure, Richard had arranged for Torres to disappear with a new identity and a substantial payment for his silence. Jeff had been left to face bankruptcy and public humiliation alone. Victoria's hands trembled as she read her father's notes about monitoring Jeff's subsequent struggles. Richard had tracked his financial difficulties, his divorce, his descent into service work. There were even photographs of Jeff with 6-year-old Sophia, taken by private investigators who had followed them to playgrounds and school events. The final document was a memo dated just 3 months ago, after Victoria had hired Jeff for the foundation. Continue surveillance of Martinez. Daughter may be useful leverage if architect becomes problematic. Recommend maintaining current arrangement unless subject poses renewed threat to company interests. Victoria felt physically sick as the full scope of her father's cruelty became clear. Jeff hadn't just been the victim of one man's betrayal. He had been systematically destroyed by someone with the resources to ruin lives for the sake of marginal business advantages. And her father had continued monitoring him like a predator watching wounded prey. She thought about every conversation she'd had with Jeff, every moment of professional respect and growing personal affection, knowing now that it was all built on a foundation of lies. Her family's money, the foundation she ran, even the opportunity that had brought them together, everything was tainted by her father's calculated cruelty. Victoria made copies of everything and drove to Jeff's apartment, her heart pounding with each mile. She found him on his fire escape, unable to sleep, and sketching designs by streetlight while Sophia slept inside. When he saw her face, he immediately set down his pencil. "What's wrong?" he asked, climbing back through the window to meet her in his small living room. Victoria placed the folder on his kitchen table, her voice barely steady. "I found something tonight. About what really happened to your business. About my father's involvement." She watched Jeff's expression change as he opened the folder and began reading. The color drained from his face as the magnitude of the betrayal became clear. "He destroyed everything I built," Jeff whispered, staring at surveillance photos of himself and Sophia. "And he's been watching us this whole time." Victoria knelt beside his chair, tears streaming down her face. "Jeff, I had no idea. I swear to you, I didn't know any of this when I hired you. But I understand if you can't forgive me for being part of the family that ruined your life." Jeff was quiet for a long moment, processing the revelation that his suffering hadn't been random misfortune but deliberate malice. Then he looked at Victoria, seeing her genuine anguish and the courage it had taken to bring him this information. "There's something else you need to know," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "The foundation, my trust fund, everything I used to help you, it all comes from money my father made destroying people like you. I can't keep living off blood money, pretending I'm doing good when it's all built on cruelty." She reached into her purse and pulled out legal documents she had prepared that afternoon. "I'm dissolving my trust fund and liquidating my personal assets. The money is going into an independent foundation that will be managed by community leaders, not Ashford family members. I can't change what my father did, but I can make sure his money stops being used to hurt people." Jeff stared at her, speechless. Victoria was giving up millions of dollars, walking away from the wealth and security that had defined her entire life. "Victoria, you don't have to do that. This isn't your fault." "It is my fault," she insisted. "Maybe I didn't know the details, but I knew my father was ruthless. I benefited from his cruelty for 28 years without asking hard questions. That makes me complicit." She stood up, wiping her eyes. "I'm going to make sure you get justice, Jeff. Full restitution for what you lost, public vindication of your reputation, everything. And then I'm going to disappear from your life so you never have to see an Ashford face again." As Victoria turned toward the door, Jeff caught her hand. "Wait," he said quietly. "What if I don't want you to disappear?" Victoria looked at him with surprise and hope. "After everything my family did to you?" Jeff pulled her closer, his voice soft but certain. "You're not your father, Victoria. You proved that tonight. The woman who gave up everything to make things right, who cared more about justice than money, that's who I fell in love with." When their lips met, it felt like coming home after years of being lost. Outside, Chicago hummed with late-night energy. But inside Jeff's small apartment, two people who had found each other across impossible circumstances held each other tight and began planning a future built on truth instead of lies. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.